seen, okay, this meeting is being recorded. I need to click yes to keep going. All right. So we've all probably seen a figure like this. So this is global temperature in the past, the black line, and various colors of what it could look like going forward. And so normally here's where around a room I do a straw poll and say, well, which of these outcomes do you think is the most likely? So at the bottom, we've got the dark blue color. That's the Paris Climate Agreement target of holding us to about a 2-degree warming. So that requires deep and rapid decarbonization. There's the current policies, if, pledges to the Paris Climate Agreement, if they're successful, and that is an if, but that'll put us in that sort of light blue territory. And then at the top, we've got this red, which is our current emission trajectory, and if our climate policies are unsuccessful. So different futures. You can throw in, if you want to, in the chat room, you can tell me what you think the outcome is. The bottom line for, oops, something's goofy going on here. Oh, there we go. The bottom line for tourism, though, is regardless of which of these futures we go down, they will be transformative for tourism. And the reason for that is challenge one, to get to that sort of those two blue scenarios, we have to rapidly decarbonize our economy. And that requires tourism to do that, but tourism will also have to respond to how the global economy is decarbonizing as well. And then challenge two is we're already seeing the impacts of climate change in different ecosystems, different sectors. That will only increase as climate change accelerates, whether we land at a +2 world or a +3 world or beyond. That too will have implications for tourism because it already does. So we've got to look at what are those impacts and how do we adjust to those as well. So that's what we'll try to cover in the time that I've got today. A little bit, I mean, we can't cover the entire range, but we'll give you a little bit of a taste of both of those sort of futures and what they mean for tourism. So I'll start with the outcome that I think we'd all like to see, which is we land in a +2 world. So what does that mean for tourism in terms of getting there? And as some of these cartoons and images and headlines suggest, the solutions to climate change have consequences, not just for tourism, for many parts of our economy, for many of our communities that are destinations as well. So we have to explore what does that transition to a low carbon economy mean for us. And if we start with tourism and the question of, well, how much of a contributor to the problem is tourism as a sector? About 15 years ago, we did a report for the UNWTO at the time asking that question, and the contribution we had in 2005, we estimated that tourism emitted approximately 5% of global CO2 emissions at the time. And you can see the bulk of those transportation was approximately 75% of that. So that was the biggest challenge we had. More recent study on the right, lower right, different data, slightly different methodology, newer data, they came up with an estimate of about 8%. So it's probably safe to say we're in that range, 5 to 8%. Well, what does that mean? Well, that's about Canada and India put together. So the world is not going to leave Canada and India alone to just do their own thing. We can't solve climate change without that 8% or 5%. And so tourism won't be left on the sidelines either. So we know we have to get on with decarbonization. One of our biggest challenges is aviation. How are we going to handle that? So we'll take a look at some of those challenges just briefly. The other big challenge tourism has, we've got a starting point, we're a meaningful contributor, but again, pre-COVID, our growth rate was such that we would have ended up in that sort of plus 135 or so % by mid-century. Again, if growth projections in the industry held. That leaves a big gap for where the industry wants to get to. So just last year, the World Travel and Tourism Council signed on to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change to become climate neutral by mid-century. So that means we have to get down to that light blue range in the next sort of 30 years. That's a huge task ahead of us. How are we going to potentially go about doing that? One of the questions about how you would get there is looking, instead of tourism having a plan, how they're going to decarbonize, because we don't have a plan currently. That's one of the shortcomings in the sector. Another way to look at it is for those scenarios that have actually, or the energy futures who have actually developed scenarios by which we'd achieve a plus 1.5 or a plus 2 world, where is tourism within that? And so we've gone to all of those sort of plus 2 world compatible energy futures and had a look at, well, where is tourism within those? And the answer is most don't actually identify tourism specifically. Most do identify aviation or air travel as a component of it. So I just took one of the most recent examples. This one comes from the sort of international standard. It's the International Energy Agency. And you can see, how are they thinking aviation will be dealt with? Well, a big part of their solution is what they would call behavioral change. Read demand management. So all that pretty yellow at the bottom of those lines, that's behavioral change that they think aviation over the next 10, certainly 30 years, their emissions can be reduced by about 60%. What does that mean in terms of behavioral shifts? Well, on the right side, you see a couple bullets of what does that actually mean. So the first one is eliminating flights of less than 1 hour. So that's Toronto to Ottawa, gone around the world, notionally, right? Reducing long numbers in long haul and business flights by 3/4. Those are not inconsequential changes to a tourism sector if that's how they think tourism, particularly international tourism, can get there. What are some other options? These might appeal more to certainly industry. So on the left, you've got the demand constraint or demand management. We've dealt with that a little bit, so we'll leave that to the side. And if you asked me even 2 years ago, if I thought there was a low carbon option for air travel, I probably would have said no. All of the biofuel solutions that the industry had touted before that, none of them were scalable. They just never proved to be useful. That's changed. So now we've got a couple of different options. If you've flown out of Vancouver in the past on some of the puddle jumpers out of their Harbor Air now flies the first sort of commercial aircraft that is electrified. So there's that. We're seeing new test flights for hydrogen fuel powered flight. So there's prototypes for that. In the picture, there's Airbus has 3 different options that they're working on. Again, most of those would be sort of Porter regional planes, not long haul, but they're coming, and those will have niche markets for sure. Like Porter could electrify and do a bunch of its routes. But the other one that would help solve the long haul question is it's more of a circular economy solution, but it's capturing CO2 out of the air. So it's removing CO2, so that's good, but it converts it into a synthetic fuel, which can go into anything from automobiles to replace Jet A fuel. So that's usable already, and it's shown it's completely scalable. So you could produce that fuel in St. Lucia, you could do it in Europe, you can do it in Vancouver. The only question is cost. What does it do in terms of cost for the travel? And that's the question that has to be worked out over time as that technology is scaled. So there are some technological solutions coming. Each of those will have slightly different implications for flight and distribution of travelers. How do you get to the Caribbean? How do you get to Europe? And what's that going to cost? And those are the types of things we have to sort out in the coming years. The other side, optimistically as well, a lot of decarbonization will be done for tourism. So this isn't something like aviation where we as a sector really have to focus on tackling that. You're seeing electric grids around the world being decarbonized. Ontario, we're lucky we have a largely decarbonized grid already. Quebec is almost completely hydro as well. And so that means you can electrify, whether it's road transport. You'll see May to the Mist in the left side, that will be electrified next year. Bombardier has a range of even recreational vehicles, all of which can be electrified. And if you're running that off a clean grid, that doesn't have additional carbon consequences to it. So those are the types of changes that will benefit from. It will still require investment and fleet renewal over time and things like that, taxis, etc. But those are all solvable even with technology that we have today. So that's some of the good news. So what's all that going to cost? Well, we looked at this a couple of years ago with a range of different economic models at the time. And what we saw is in the 2020s, actually not a lot. There's a lot of what people will call low-hanging fruit, things that, inefficient bus fleets, older aircraft, etc., that we can sort out. Even hotels, a lot of work that can be done there that actually is cost effective. So that's where we start. As we go progressively decade by decade, you can see what happens to the price. Well, it goes up. And so 3.6% is not inconsequential. That's in the billions of dollars. But it's when the tourism economy, again, pre-COVID, would have doubled or be 2.5 times larger than it is today. So is that acceptable? Well, I think for most cases, it actually would be. And if you convert that cost into, well, what does the traveler pay at the time when we divided it up equally amongst international travelers and domestic travelers, it would come out to about US $11 a trip. Well, we all pay for that in bag fees, your burger at the airport, whatever the case. It might only buy you a bag of chips at an airport, not a burger anymore. But it's a type of fee structure that we pay regularly whenever we travel. So when you're doing a bigger trip or a business traveler, most people aren't even going to notice that type of price to pay for a decarbonized tourism economy. So the world's going to try to get there to that sort of +2 world regardless. So some of those costs, we're going to have to figure out how best to do those. The other big policy question we looked at in that last slide was, is it cheaper or more cost effective to just buy carbon offsets from other sectors and let them do the heavy lifting? And what we found in the end, it wasn't, and it left you really vulnerable to having to decarbonize very rapidly in a post or 2050s timeframe. So we're going to have to pay for some of those prices, those costs to decarbonize the tourism sector. Just the question is, when, what best way to do it, what type of incentives government's going to give the tourism sector to do so, and is that going to be part of a post-COVID restructuring or economic stimulus that we can take advantage of that to try to help rebuild a tourism economy for climate future. Even if we get there, the second challenge, as I mentioned, is tourism in a post-3-degree world. Most people, most scientists, I should say, not policy people, they're always optimistic, don't think we'll actually be able to hold the +2. So let's look at, well, what does that potentially mean from a local all the way up to sort of global scale for tourism development? And if we look at what are the different pathways that climate change can impact the tourism sector from an impacts perspective, there's 4, and the blue one with the arrows at the bottom there. So when the climate itself changes, everything from how severe our winters are to whether it's our Gulf seasons, etc., that affects season length, demand patterns, and then we have extreme events, be they hurricanes, fires, whatever the case is, that affect some of our assets, our infrastructure. So that's the sort of direct impacts. And then the second one, the green ones, are where climate change affects the environmental systems that tourism is founded on. So sea level rise in some cases, erosion that comes with it, again, changing ski seasons, bleaching of coral reefs, what other biodiversity is impacted. And then the third one that those are the 2 that most of the research is focused on so far. The third one that we don't know a heck of a lot about, to be honest, is how climate change affects the socioeconomic systems that affect or drive tourism. So the map that I've put in there, you can see the climate change, one estimate of climate change impact on the global economy. everything from the countries in blue, where there's some opportunities or potential benefits for GDP, all the way through to the red, the very negative. And you can see Canada is one of the countries that is in that sort of blue territory, that depending on sector, depending on region, there's opportunities as well as risks in our economy. And then the other one beside it, what does it mean for migration, international security, things that where conflict, unrest, those are things that tourism just stays away from. And then the final one, we've talked a little bit about emission reduction policy. So that's one option. But other sectors are going to adapt to climate change too, whether it's insurance, particularly the investment community is already adapting. Those will have implications for tourism as well. So we don't have time to explore examples of maybe all of those, but I'll give you a couple of Canadian examples. We'll start sort of local and work our way up to a couple of global examples, just so you get a sense of the different scales where climate change can be impactful. So in our own country, again, we can start with changes in climate itself, shifting demand in different ways. There are what some people would call last chance tourism. So polar bear tourism in the Hudson Bay region is probably not going to be a thing that you would be able to do, certainly by mid-century. I would argue probably sooner than that. We have assets, tourism assets, whether it's glaciers, retreating, viewpoints changing, the safety of tourists changing, and infrastructure damage, whether it's on coasts, fires, in other cases. And then the last one, we have new opportunities. So changing ice in the Arctic has opened up a new market in terms of cruise tourism. There too, we want to understand, well, how do we work with and or in some cases protect communities that may or may not want that type of tourism to be happening in their area. And so we'll start with a sort of regional example. What does climate change mean for the ski industry? And for those of you, hopefully some of you know what a yard sale is. It's when my teenage daughters fly past me and knock dad over and thinks it's hilarious as equipment goes flying in different directions. If you ask the media, what does climate change mean for the ski industry? You can tell from the titles there. They've made their decision up, years ago. And for many years, the media would ask me, so what is climate change doing to the ski industry? And they were always surprised at my response when I said nothing. And I use, in this case, to illustrate that point, US data, because they have better data than we do. From the 80s to the 90s, from the 90s to the 2000s, those blue arrows pointing up, ski seasons across the US regional markets were increasing, even as temperatures were warming. The reason for that, we were investing millions, tens, probably hundreds of millions of dollars in snowmaking, right? It's only in this last decade that situation has changed. So those red arrows that are ticking down, now, even with that massive investment in snowmaking, it can't offset the warming that we've seen in this decade. So some are starting to ask that question, have we reached sort of peak skiing? And that's the sort of position that we're in today. We can also look locally, what have we seen in record winters in our own market, and what's that able to teach us? When we look at average ski season, the record warm winter that we had in our area, 2011 to 12 season, average ski season was shortened by about 16 days. So, about 1/5 of the season. But more importantly, the percentage of operating lifts and then terrain that was open were far less than that. So the system capacity or supply was actually changed more than that. To keep that, snowmaking had increased, particularly early in the season, by 3 times what it normally was. So that's an additional cost. And they had to do that with about 25% fewer snowmaking days. So in the end, in that season, skier visits only decreased 10%. So that was the good news. But the incidence of crowding was going up because you were packing that 90% of skier visits into 80% of a ski season with maybe 70% of your terrain and lifts open. So that's the question is, are the Blue Mountains, et cetera, of the world going to be able to provide that same visitor experience, even if they're able to open? And that's a different question. And of course, the multi-billion-dollar question is, what of the future for that market? This is some modeling that we've done for all of Eastern North America, so Quebec, Ontario, and New England. markets, and you can see at the top an RCP 4.5 is that low carbon sort of world, and the 8.5 is the high carbon scenario. And you can see how different the two futures are for the ski industry. If you look at the low carbon, particularly if you look at the Blue Mountains and the sort of Aurelia Berry area, lots of sort of still green dots. And those are ski seasons that are probably still profitable for those areas. We see some of those now. So they should be able to grapple or deal with those. The sort of Glen Edens and the Chicopee down in our area, I don't have a lot of faith that those will be around in the distant future. But if we look at the warmer scenario, it's a very different outcome for Southern Ontario, particularly as you go further past mid-century. There's not a lot left of our ski market. So that demand would either disappear or it would have to shift to go further north in Ontario, maybe to Quebec, in higher elevation areas in Vermont and in New Hampshire that you can see in the state. And you can see there too, a lot of Western New York, the southern areas, those two ski areas just wouldn't be profitable in that type of scenario. The other area that I'll just give a few words about that I do some work in, but so do Sonia and Rachel and probably others in your department in the school. So it's where a lot of Canadians go. And it really shows the potential for compounding impacts of climate change. And I use the example from the Caribbean Tourism Organization 12 or so years ago. They set out to us 6 different types of impacts or risks that they wanted to know more about. So there was temperature changes, coral reef bleaching, sea level rise, hurricane extreme events, and water supply. And then there was one that we pointed out that was a bit of a blind spot to them that we've talked a little bit already, but carbon pricing and the ability to get to the region to begin with. So we'll say a few words about a couple of these because we've had a PhD student from the region actually doing her PhD and doing a lot of interviews over the last 2 years or so. And one of the things we keep hearing back from the sector is that sector relevant information that they could act on, that they could make decisions with, is still a big barrier to them as they see it. So that's still an opportunity for all of our scholars, whether it's master's students through PhDs and all of us, to contribute to helping solve over time. So the first question you can see up in the top right, that was a question that was asked, if their climate changes, will people still come? Will it be too hot? If the climate changes back in Canada, will people still come? And the answer to the first question is it's really not an issue. When we've surveyed tourists in the region of what they're looking for in terms of climate preferences, many of the small island developing states, the destinations in the region, still are in that sort of ideal or Goldilocks zone. Like they don't typically get too hot. There are a couple of exceptions to that, but by and large, even under climate change, they're doing fine. So that's really not an issue that they have to worry too much about. Hurricanes, we see this almost every year now. Somebody gets clobbered. The last, Bahamas was latest on that list, unfortunately. So one of the things that we did for a World Bank study was to actually look at how differential that risk is to extreme events and hurricanes within the region, because many of them are treated identically from an insurance perspective. But as this map shows, this is the one where we actually mapped the number of category 3, 4, or 5 storms that they've experienced winds within those 4,800 resorts. And you can see, the Cuba, Bahamas, yes, they're in that high risk zone, but places like St. Lucia, Trinidad and Tobago, down at the bottom, really don't have a lot of risk, and that will be even less so going forward. So they shouldn't be treated the same. That being said, when they are hit, what we've seen is the tourism sector is actually quite resilient in most cases. There are some really, devastating storms that we'll see an example of. But usually within 6 months, the arrivals have recovered back to sort of pre-storm levels. So that's positive. in part because the tourism infrastructure is typically built better than a lot of the other infrastructure in the region. So it is more resilient to that type of damage. But what we do see is often some of the communities around that tourism infrastructure are crushed by storms, and that when we're seeing that in the media constantly, people just don't want to go look at that as an option for a holiday, and rightfully so. But it's a communication challenge, because when the storm, whether it was Puerto Rico or in this case, we've got a quote from the tourism minister in Bahamas, is 75, or no, it was actually 85% of their hotel capacity was still functioning. So Nassau wasn't affected at all. So, they're asking people, if we're going to rebuild and recover from this storm, we need tourists back in our country. And that's a big communication challenge that they've faced repeatedly. That and for us to better educate Canadians and Americans and others about the geography of the region, that when there's a storm in Bahamas, it's still quite safe to go to Jamaica or somewhere else. When we look at the future of storms in that region, the bad news is, while more storms are not likely, the storms that do happen, proportionately, they will be more of the sort of category 4 or 5, the stronger storms that have the biggest impact. And that has two very important implications. One, from an insurability perspective, how the insurance industry treats tourism. Will they see it as too high a risk to continue? And because that will have really important decisions or implications for where tourism is built, where it's rebuilt, how it's built. And so that's an important adaptation that we have to keep an eye on. The other one is, when we've done research in the region, there was only 2 countries we could find that had something similar to our unemployment insurance. So what happens, whether it's the current pandemic or when one of these storms goes through and knocks out tourism facilities for 6-8 months, people are left, without the same sort of social safety net that we are accustomed to. And so understanding what the real implications for tourism workers are, and what are any potential solutions to that, is something that really needs to be done. Whether that's, if everybody paid $1 a bed night into an insurance fund for workers around the region, something to that effect, where the industry could solve it if governments can't. Those are the kind of creative solutions that I think we have to do more of. The other big longer-term risk that they're interested in the region, of course, is sea level rise. We see what it does already in terms of beach erosion and flooding in some areas. And we had done some work about almost a decade ago now, that we looked at about 1,000 resorts, bigger ones around the region. And at the time, we could only do 1 meter increments for sea level rise. That's all the satellite data would give us. And so these are maps, if you know Atlantis. You can see that on the picture on the right, and it's in this area. If you've ever walked their boardwalk, it's all along, and those are the beaches out there. You can see what it does in terms of flooding, but also erosion. And then when we scaled that up throughout the region, it was about 1/3 of resorts would be potentially flooded, and more of those would be impacted by erosion before that. We knew at the time that was probably an underestimate, because the satellite data at the time was quite coarse. So when we sent students in to do some of the ground truthing, where they would do the GPS-based surveying, the satellite data are the grid cells that you see. The lines underneath it are from the surveying the students did. And you could see there's areas that the satellite data don't even recognize as land. And they certainly weren't getting the elevation right. And we know that's actually been a problem with some of the satellite data that's been used around the world. Now we finally have a new product that's available that solves those problems, that allows us to look at sub-meter sea level rise, much higher spatial resolution as well. And so we can begin to see, what does that look like? So that same 4,800 resorts that we looked at from a hurricane risk, we've now done that for sea level rise, sort of mid-century and late century. And you can see the results on the right. Even by mid-century, we're looking at 25, maybe 30% of those 4,800 resorts having risks posed to them. And some of them we see, like as the picture reveals, are already an issue. When I say that to both in the region and to travelers, and as well as some of the real estate people that invest, including institutional investors in tourism real estate, or at least were before COVID, they have a hard time getting their head around, well, what does 1 meter sea level rise look like in a resort context? So if you're roughly 6 feet tall, you stand at the high tide mark, 1 meter is in this case up to about the guy's waist. That gives you a sense of what does 1 meter look like. And that's what it does to a beach area. That's what it does to a low-lying resort. You can get those sort of visualizations and people begin to understand, what does that mean? So then we get to the responses. You know, how do you respond? And the first one is you can retreat or abandon. In most islands in the Caribbean don't have a decommissioning policy. Who's responsible to safely, environmentally take that down? And in most cases, they never are. They just sit there. They're sort of abandoned eyesores for a period of time. The middle option is to protect, so a small seawall, armored, an artificial beach that you can sit on, and then a pool up on top of that. Well, that works for the sort of spring break booze hound type of market, but that's not what your high yield markets are wanting to pay for. They want a naturally functioning beach. That requires beach nourishment. And so that has real cost implications. Not every place in the Caribbean certainly can afford that. Some islands couldn't even pick one beach to be able to afford to do that without international assistance. So an island like the Jamaica might be able to do 2 of those areas. So which of those is it going to be? And what does that have in terms of implications for the development of those areas? So those are some examples, you know, locally to one of the regions we go to. And then of course we want to look at, well, if you scale all those up to, well, what does that mean for global patterns? And that's a really difficult question. What we've done so far is sort of take some examples of different types of assets that will be affected, but then trying to convert that into patterns of demand, competitiveness, and what does that mean for destination sustainability is still, you know, a lot of work needs to happen in that area. And so that's where we look to colleagues like yourselves that are tourism experts to apply that expertise to understand what some of these implications might be. But I'll just give you a couple of quick examples. So for those of you who are into mega events, what does it mean for the Winter Olympics? We had done some work a couple of years ago, and you can see over time, the 21 host communities that have hosted the games in the past, when we looked at their climate reliability, now even places like Sochi are on a good year. But as we move forward under different warming scenarios, you can see under a high emission scenario by the end of the century, there's only 8 of them left. Luckily, they are distributed around the world, so they're not just clustered in one place, which is good. But if that's the narrowing of your field, and then some of them like Calgary, which is still climate reliable, says no for other reasons, where is the Winter Olympics going to go? And this was a question that was actually a bit posed to us. We did some work this summer for the IOC. If not these 21 locations, where could you host it, where the hosts might be amenable to actually hosting the games going forward? So it's good to see they're at least looking at that strategic view. The other big one, World Heritage Sites are obviously an attraction around the world. And when we've looked at that same sort of sea level rise and erosion risk for those, I think it was about 340 that we found were within 300 meters of the coast. You can see even under a lower emission scenario there in the middle, the RCP 4.5, there's only about 77 or, you know, a third of them that weren't at least partially flooded. And most, some are already armored, like some of the more urban locations that you see there. And there's the rare occasion where you have floodgates like Venice has opened up this year that you see on the very right. But most of the other locations, particularly in the developing countries, can't afford that type of protection. So if we include all of those different types of risks and we put them together, this was the question that we had from the UNEP of what are some of the development implications of tourism as a development strategy, or tourism contributing to the SDGs. We combined about, I think, 27 different indicators for as many countries as we could, and this gives you a sense of the geography of risk. Again, some of the countries like Canada, where there could be some benefits or market opportunities as well as risks, all the way down to some other parts of the world, including countries like Mexico and some other fairly big tourism economies, where we would expect fairly substantial negative impacts. And then if we look even more importantly at that nexus between climate change risk and tourism's contribution to GDP, so economic reliance, everything up in that upper right quadrant, they're almost all small island developing states from different parts of the world. But that's where that climate justice question really comes in. If their tourism economies are going to suffer, how does the world help them develop either other parts of the economy, be more amenable to migration from some of those countries? What are the different types of adaptation and assistance that can be offered? So that was a grand tour, fairly quick in terms of different types of implications for tourism. So now I'm going to turn to the question, is tourism ready? And here I'm going to sort of reflect on 20 years of whether you call it pain and suffering or opportunities to work in this sector on this question. And I go back again, probably almost 15 years ago. We did some work, a special report for the UN, WTO, and UNEP and WMO at the time. And we concluded that report with this statement that the scientific evidence was clear: climate change must be considered the greatest challenge to sustainable tourism in the 21st century. And we were thrilled, we were proud that made it through the political filters and it made it into the sort of conclusion of the report. And then they added a point that was, climate change is calling tourism world to a revolution. And we thought, great, we've got this started. So we're going to see some real progress over the coming years and decades. So let's think about what that progress, that revolution looked like. Well, we saw last year, it was a bit of a deja vu moment. The World Travel and Tourism Council came to the party. So that's the industry arm. With this statement, the reality is that climate change is outpacing us. It is the single biggest threat to the travel and tourism sector. I was like, well, yeah, we've seen that before. So that was a statement that was very similar to what we said 15 years ago. So that wasn't particularly newsworthy to see. What was good to see is they also put this, to call it an action plan is to be generous or polite. There is no plan, but they agreed to an ambition to be climate neutral by 2050. So that was an important statement that they did make. So if you asked me what my thought of the reality of the revolution is blah 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 is a good summary of it. We were a bit more eloquent in our critique that we published in this Journal of Sustainable Tourism, where we called it an impasse with global tourism leaders' views. And if you read SCIF, their opinions were very much similar. This organization's attempt at a response has left some to wonder if it's capable of doing anything other than cheerleading for particularly mass tourism. So even within the sector, similar sort of views. It's not just coming from academics. We need to do more. The industry has to take this more seriously. So with Suzanne Becken's help, some of you will know her name as well, we looked around the world to see, well, what is the state of either climate change in tourism policy documents or tourism in climate change documents, so at that nexus. And what we found, I think we found just over 100 different policy documents from 60 or so countries. And basically what we found was that in the tourism policies, there's very little on climate change. And it's usually just a brief mention if it is there. Most of the progress is being made is actually by climate change people, including tourism in their policies, but they don't know anything typically about tourism, and that's a real problem. So tourism is not at the table when some of these decisions are being made, and that's something that really needs to change in the coming decade or two. And then we might ask the question, does the travel market crowd get it? Well, this is just this one headline that I saw very recently was, 7 positive predictions for travel after the COVID pandemic. The first one was great. People are seeing climate change is real during the pandemic and will take strong efforts to combat it. Followed up with number 3 and 7, the unbelievable travel deals. Flights will be cheap for years. We're just going to keep going. I don't think they make the connections between what is strong climate change response and business as usual before the pandemic. The two just are not aligned. So we definitely have more work to do in that respect. And then the final point that I'd sort of make in that respect is that we have to look in the mirror ourselves as an academic community. Are we researching like our house is on fire, as Greta would ask us? And if we look at this line, sort of when we published the report for the UNWTO back in 2007, since then, the number of publications has increased substantially. So, okay, well, that's good progress. But it has in all aspects of academic publishing. So when we look on the far right there, the percentage of climate change focused papers in the top 5 tourism journals, yes, it's increased, but it's still less than 4%. So we're doing a lot of other stuff not related to what is probably one of the greatest threats or impacts on our sector for the next several decades. So we too have to do things better internally. There's, on the positive side, there's a lot of work to do, a lot of gaps, but there's also a lot of opportunities for young researchers, both in Canada, but certainly other parts of the world where there are big geographic gaps, including the Caribbean. So with some of that, I do want to end on a positive note, because I do see, again, leadership coming. It's not coming from the top down, as I've pointed out. You probably got that sense of what I think of UNWTO and WTTC on that perspective. Neither are leading on the climate file. But where we do see some leadership, here's just a couple of examples. Some of it is coming from the financial sector. So regional investment banks, institutional investors, I get calls about whether it's ski areas, investing in coastal real estate. People want to know, they're starting to implement that in their decisions. And you can see this is some funding for a new tourism strategy and action plan for Jamaica. 3 of the 5 main objectives actually have a climate change component in it. So the resilience of tourism, how do you reduce the contribution to climate change? So Jamaican tourism in a low carbon economy. So that's great to see. And then on the other side, where we might expect to see leadership in a European context, both for leaders on tourism, but also leaders on climate for sure, they too, Stefan Gosling and I wrote a report for them, and then they had a follow-up workshop where all of their members came together and produced this sort of action agenda. These are the different action plan or statements that they have, which are all great, and we'll see how they follow up and put some real details to those. But the final one I'll just draw your attention to is, how they define success, because I think that's key, and that's something certainly I know Rachel and Sonia will want to discuss. Is they looked at it and said, our previous definition of a success is growth in visitor numbers, and they acknowledged, that perspective is outdated. So that's great to see, because it does represent a very different way of thinking within the industry than what we've typically seen over the last 10, 20 years. So what are some take-home messages from all of this? Well, one, as I said, climate change is already affecting investment decisions. I get calls from independently wealthy people to institutional investors, to different businesses, to pension plans. People are starting to think, in the longer term, what does this mean for investing in tourism? So the pressure is going to come from outside the sector. They will have to increasingly disclose climate risk, understand climate risk. So there'll be a lot to do with the sector and with destinations over time to understand that second point. How is climate change and climate policy going to alter the competitiveness and sustainability of either your business or your destination? And hopefully, as I've pointed out and made fairly clear, both a +2 world and a post +3 world, they're going to transform tourism, but for different reasons. So it's not an if, there's no escape route outcome that we don't have to do a lot. Both cases, we're going to have to make tourism look a lot different than it has been over the last 30 years. Another important takeaway is there are real distributive consequences, whether you call that climate justice or whatever you want to, that term you want to put to it, for both of those outcomes. So that's something that has to, and I think that has to particularly come from the academic community to point that out and show some of the options for how that might be addressed. The bottom line is, tourism as a sector is unprepared for either one of these outcomes. But that being said, we have to look at this as an opportunity for change. I think that some people have said, don't let a good crisis go to waste. Well, whether that's the pandemic or whether it's climate change, we have to look at it through that lens. And so I hope those of you who are students that are watching and have a passion for both tourism and perhaps a passion for climate action as well, will take up this challenge of helping to reinvent a climate compatible tourism economy. Because the sector, the profession, the research community, we all desperately need you to do that. So I look forward to hopefully working with some of you on that in the years to come. And with that, I've probably used up far more than my time that some of you want to hear me. So I will say thank you very much again for letting me be part of your series, and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Dan. I invite anyone, if you have any questions for Dan at the time, type your questions into the chat, and I will just moderate that for you. But Dan, so listening to this, you've said you've been doing this for over 20 years. I as well, and
you're not that old.
I am. But doesn't it drive you nuts? Like, I listen to this and like, I feel like I've listened to this before. I mean, with different information. And of course I have, and I've been working on this, and you've been working on this. And yeah, there's some really great things. Like, we had Lee Barnes, the chief operational officer from Intrepid Travel, come on, and he announced that they're the first tour operator to develop like science-based climate change targets.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's great. That's one. And then the Jamaica project, that's also was really cool and really interesting and great. But where is the actual action? Like, even if we look at it from the perspective of just Canada and policy, like what you did with Suzanne Becken, I think is really interesting, because even though we've been talking about this, like if you think since the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, what have you really seen like happen, right? Little things here and there, but do you see like a major shift, or like, are you still feeling positive about this, or do you kind of go cry in the corner after you get off of these calls?
Some nights do require beverages, yes.
Yeah.
But the last, I am more positive about the whole climate action for the last sort of 2 years. Because and the reason for that is I see a real beginning of a social shift. When you see tens of thousands or millions of people marching in the street for something, that gives politicians who wanted to act the right way in the past, and business leaders, but who had to fight with boards, had to fight with electorate. Now, the numbers are on their side. And until they got sort of that license, some of the harder decisions that all of those leaders would have to make was really difficult to do. Now I think they have that social license to act. And then, just as we got that momentum, along came COVID. And I think that's sort of taken the legs out of the climate file for certainly this year, and rightfully so. It has to be that way. I just don't know how quickly it will actually recover back to the momentum that we had. The one positive piece from the pandemic is and we see it in Europe in particular, but the sort of green stimulus that they have, that might actually accelerate some of the climate action, the climate investment that wouldn't have taken place without or it might have trickled in a little bit slower. I hope Canada will do some of the same. We're going to make a once in a lifetime or once in a generation type of investment. Let's make sure that positions us well for the next economy that has to come. I'm really worried about the States on that. Again, we'll see next week what direction that's going to go. It could be either a big step forward from an investment perspective or the nails in the coffin. So we'll see.
Yeah, well, I think everyone's hoping that it's going to go the way that we want it to go. I have a question from Frederick. Frederick Dimanche, you said Canada might benefit from climate change, or at least in terms of tourism. Is that the reason why Canada is so behind on green initiatives? No fast train network, no incentive for people to buy smaller and more gas efficient cars. Is there a political will to wait and see despite political messages to the contrary?
There certainly has been, and things changed. I worked for Environment Canada prior to the Harper era, and knew many people in the government during the Harper era. And so that absolutely knocked the wind out of the sails of anything in terms of progressive, even climate science at the time, let alone action. Under Trudeau, again, very different perspective. And so investment has come, some actions from many people would say not nearly enough. But again, you've got to move at a pace that your electorate will tolerate. So it's not that not that they see opportunities in the tourism sector. I think when you talk to the Canadian Tourism Commission and talk climate change, their eyes just roll back, and they frankly don't have a clue. The ones that I've talked to, so they're not even thinking climate change. So that's certainly not driving the government agenda. What does it mean for tourism? What does it mean for our big infrastructure investment? We've talked about high-speed train from Toronto to Montreal and Ottawa since the 70s, or at least decent train connections. That still hasn't happened. Subway to the Toronto airport, like all of these sort of things that would have made a lot of sense over time, just weren't happening for a range of different reasons. So it's not just that the tourism economy could benefit in some ways. Ag, our economy is such that we're climate limited in a number of ways. And so a little bit of warming for parts of our economy, parts of our communities can be a good thing. And while some climate activists don't particularly like me or other people saying that, we have to be intellectually honest. Life goes on 500, 1,000 kilometers south of us. It doesn't end. So economies can shift. There'll be challenges, absolutely, and there'll be some vulnerable communities that we really have to look out for. But we also want to understand where the opportunities are, not just within Canada, but in the global marketplace, so that we can take advantage of those.
Mm-hmm. I always find it also a bit maddening that, like, for example, this so happens to be at the same time as the TIO Summit, the Tourism Industry Association of Ontario Summit. But, when I go to these things, I want to hear from people like you, like where are we talking about climate change? They'll always have some token green person talking about something related to sustainability in the tourism industry, but not, no concrete actual action seems to be happening. And I don't know, I think in different parts of the world, probably they're a lot more maybe educated when it comes to this, but I just don't see that happening in a Canadian context. And so do you find that you get, asked to come to a lot of the industry stuff?
Not in Canada.
Not in Canada. Yeah.
So that's my experience here too. I more often am invited to Asia or to Europe to speak on different issues. And it's, that was my sort of point on the travel market thing. We tried that. We did Berlin, we did London. And we had a session, and they were well attended, a couple hundred people, but there's 20,000 people at it. So you're getting like 0.1% in your session kind of thing. So, and there's not that top-down leadership, even for things that we asked UNWTO, again, 15 years ago, come up with a guide. Like, how would you assess climate risk for a destination, whether it's Negrelin or Jamaica as a whole? Come up with a framework that everybody could follow that. and find funders that would help those communities actually do that. And something as simple as that wasn't done. And so that's a bit frustrating. And so the leadership at that sort of global level just isn't vocal, with the exception. So Jeffrey Lippman, as you know, is a good shit disturber within the industry, because he's been part of ICAO, he's been part of UNWTO, he knows all these people, and so he makes noises, and he gets some of these people together. So in Malta, I think just before the pandemic hit, a bunch of these people came together. But again, it really hasn't translated to outcomes out the back end of systematic change, or even just some of the rhetoric's there, but the follow-up of, well, how do we help countries understand what this means for you? That's where the academic community could be mobilized to help. And we'd all love to do that. But the resourcing hasn't come with that. So that's unfortunate.
And what about, you mentioned, I've done a lot of work on, eco taxes or whatever you want to call them, funding for sustainability initiatives through consumers. And, I, probably the same as you, get a lot of pushback about it, and a lot of pushback from the customer base, or the destination, thinking that customers actually don't want to pay that. But how then do we educate people? Right. So, where then again, and so does it always fall onto industry to educate? Probably not, because we have to educate industry. Does it fall on government to educate? Well, we have to, educate government. So how then, how do you think we can get the actual consumers up to speed on what's needed?
Well, I think consumers, if given the chance, and can be told, what is this for, as long as the funds are earmarked. Again, most of us aren't going to blink at a $1 a bed night levy for good reasons, whether it's to support the workers, whether it's to support sustainable tourism at large, like the UK's travel fund. Like, we're not going to blink at that. 99% of people, the odd one still might. But I find the industry and some of the government people really disingenuous, because they have no problem issuing a $10 airport development tax, marketing tax, whatever the heck you want to call it, bag charges, et cetera, but for something that is going to mean the sustainability or contribute to the sustainability of a destination, and or its workers, well, no, we don't want to do that because we don't want to have another one. So, when the Caribbean was all over the UK for its APD, levy, which was quite substantial. But then they turn around and do the same things. It was more who got that money, and how will it be used? And so that I find frustrating as well within the industry.
So I have a question from Tommy McHugh, who's our executive chef at the Ted Rogers School of Management. And he's worked in the industry for a long time, but he wants to know what steps the food industry can make that will have the most impact in the shortest period of time. So is it electric-based kitchen equipment, reduction in beef, less importing on international ingredients, bottled water from Europe?
All of the above. Which one I would put first, I'd probably defer to. So my colleague Stefan Gosling and Michael Hall, who are both have done a lot more work on the food component of whether it's the sort of the carbon footprint related to it. They've done a lot more work, and so they've probably prioritized some of those things. And it might depend on which market you're coming from, but Canada is certainly not short of good water. So we would hope that's certainly a good starting point. And water is very heavy to import, and a lot of it, well, I guess some of that could come from shipping. So all of those are good ways to look at it. That's where the hospitality sector is actually just, some leaders are starting to get their sense, not just in terms of cost, but that sort of carbon footprint that comes with it. I did see some interesting good work in the Caribbean, because they're so dependent on food and beverages coming in for the tourism sector, that when those flights stopped coming, the supply chains were really disrupted, even for domestic supply. So there too, there's been that sort of connection within the Caribbean, that they're looking at, well, how dependent do we want to be on stuff that's coming in for tourism, and what can we produce more locally. And that's where Dominican Republic, I think, has been a good example of using more of that local produced and bringing that into the tourism sector.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I also wonder about things like how, people for looking at, carbon assessments, like the normal, a business can't really undertake their own carbon assessment. Like there used to be good tools, like Environment Canada used to have a cool tool about certain things that you could do in your home to figure out how to reduce your carbon impact. But like, where are those tools? Like if someone like Tommy wanted to reduce the carbon impact in our kitchen, where would he go?
So there's a green hotels tool, and then I think within that they had a module that was focused on the food component. Again, but these are the tools that we argued for 15 years ago. Like let us help, we'll work with the industry to develop some of these tools that SMEs could use, but even bigger players could use, both in terms of the carbon footprinting component, but also identifying where is your climate risk. Because I was in the Caribbean one time and talking to some of the hotel operators, and they're, well, it rains a lot on Saturdays when we have the market. I said, if that's the biggest concern you've got, you can deal with climate change quite well. But they didn't see all of those other pieces, whether it's sea level rise, carbon pricing for travel, extreme events, changing insurance, or moving it. So that's where I think that, again, that leadership from the top down would have been very strategic. We just haven't seen it yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I have a question from, and I'm sorry, I'm going to not say your name right, and I apologize, Gilbert Hugendorn. And the question is, what kind of research or what type of research do you think should come from Africa or would add a solid contribution?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we've looked at where are the geographic gaps in knowledge, so we've looked at the IPCC documents, for example, and Stefan and I are actually doing a bibliometric analysis of that right now. Africa, Latin America, parts of Southeast Asia have sort of perpetual knowledge gaps. There's been a little bit of new work coming out of South Africa. But by and large, almost anything you can do there will contribute to understanding climate risk, preparing for adaptation. As a continent, nobody would look at them of it's your job to mitigate, although they're part of the Paris Climate Agreement as well. So I would say if you had to choose, focus on understanding the climate risks to their assets in their particular markets, but almost anywhere you can work in that region, even in Egypt, very little work even on the Mediterranean states, let alone sub-Saharan Africa. So that's absolutely a big area of research need. And again, that was part of our point to some of these international agencies years ago, that those are some of the parts of the world where they're looking at tourism as a development tool, or how do you contribute to the SDGs? Well, it's in some of those parts of the world that we would expect the impacts from climate change for tourism to be the largest. So let's figure that out, so that investment isn't made in the wrong kind of tourism or the wrong kind of markets. Chasing the Chinese market to fly them halfway around the world doesn't make a lot of sense in a low carbon economy. So if not them, then who? Let's be strategic about that.
That's a very, very good point about chasing the Chinese market to fly them halfway around the world. Because I feel like kind of before COVID, there was we had the year of tourism in China, Canada tourism in Canada, and everyone was looking towards the Chinese market as the savior. But if we're looking at this low carbon economy, why are we attracting why are we not looking within our own countries to figure out how to increase tourism this way? And I do see, you did mention, don't waste a good crisis. And I always think about the tsunami. Rachel and I did some work in Thailand, and, the tsunami happened, wiped out all of Koh Phi Phi, and then they rebuilt it crappier than before. Yeah. And so, it's the same thing right now. Like for the tourism industry, should we not be looking at developing our own low carbon tourism economy and focusing on local travel?
Absolutely. Like, so we've seen, we've had destinations that suffered from over tourism in the past. The pandemic came along and kept people closer to home, which is one of the solutions for a low carbon world, but it brought with it over tourism, whether it's the coastal areas of the UK, some of the lakes in Germany, some of our own national parks and other things. So we learned stuff from that, but that's been my point to Banff and some other communities. Whistler's at least looking at their own carbon footprint, but they're not looking at that perspective. Like, what is our market competitiveness going to be in 30 years when the world has to be notionally net zero carbon? Like, so you've got to position yourself for exactly that. How, not just how are you going to decarbonize, but what is our competitiveness in that different economy, because it's only notionally 30 years away. Look back 30 years and we all know what tourism looked like in the 90s. It wasn't radically different except for some of the internet and other pieces that have come along since it. So it behooves all of those destinations to look at who are your big market segments in the future and how can you get them, again recognizing how technology will change some of those, like, so again, Porter could be probably largely an electric regional aircraft company, and it may not change their business model all that substantially. That's a possibility. I'm sure, I would hope businesses like that are looking at, but I really don't see that long view from destinations yet.
No, they're still, well, and I've had a conversation recently about the tourism market in somewhere like the Arctic, for example. And again, it was very much focused on long haul travel. People were coming from Australia, people with, very, very wealthy people, and that was their market. But not seeing that perhaps then it could be something else. It could be the Canadian market, the domestic market. That would be, but a lot of the operators then think like, well, people don't want to travel. They don't want to pay that. But that's because we were all going everywhere else. But if we're only allowed to hang out in Canada for the next couple of years, then, there's only limited places to go. But I keep continually seeing that this isn't part of the discussion. And for me, again, and I think we have, as academics, yes, we have a role to play, but no one, if people don't listen to us or want to work with us, then how do you get that message out?
Yeah, I think some of that's, and like I said, that the financial community's really thrusting that upon some of these sectors, including tourism. So the institutional investors, but pension funds and other things. Like there was a real growth in coastal resort, coastal property investment that we would all put money into, as like you would for your RSP. Like we all bought into these funds in little bits and pieces. The pandemic sort of revealed some of the risk to that, because nobody's staying in those for the next couple of years, or very few, depending on the area. But the longer term implications of sea level rise are such that, but it's those people who understand that longer term risk, who are asking the questions of either companies, particularly publicly traded companies, but then eventually the smaller players, and that's going to translate itself into the destinations eventually. Whether it happens fast enough for our liking is certainly probably not the case, but it is happening.
And I just want to end off with one question from Isaac. So how can we create these dialogues then between these different agencies or these different stakeholders? What I guess, and if we can end on that, like how do you suggest that synergy starts to happen?
Yeah, well, and that's where I look to tourism scholars. You almost every one of you will have a network, probably good relationships with existing destinations and companies. Start there, right? Like you've got some trust. This is one of the things that I've always faced with the tourism industry. They look, when you talk about climate change, the ski areas that I would work with, etc. They look at you as a risk. They're risk averse. They don't like bad news. And if they don't know that they can trust you yet, that you're really wanting to work with them towards solutions as opposed to make them look bad or whatever the case is. So when you've got that trust established, that's a big first hurdle. and most destinations are starting to get like, it's beyond the sort of theoretical academic stuff to the point of, well, we need decision relevant information. So working with them to understand, well, what is the questions that they actually have about this, so you can deliver that, it is often a big first step too. How to get the top down speaking to the bottom up, like UNWTO supporting all of those smaller destination countries and then regions and destinations. That's a nut that I don't know how to crack, because we've been after them for 20 years, and hoping with change in leadership that things would happen. They're part of the UN family, and the UN family is so about the climate file, but yet they don't seem to want to really engage with it, other than just the usual rhetoric. So that one I'm not so sure about, but I think businesses certainly and destinations is where you're going to get that leadership come from the bottom up, if you will.
And sorry, I said one last question before, but just one last one. How can tourism and travel businesses incentivize sustainable consumer behavior that leads to enduring change?
Well, that's a big question, and goes well beyond the climate file. You and Rachel can have a go at that one. Yeah, like nobody's got a magic solution yet. Like, I think there's a whole bunch of different strategies that you can use, and it'll depend on the type of business, the market segment. I still think, even just consumer information, like if you don't know, it's like the energy ratings on your appliances or your car. Like, if you just don't know, even if you wanted to do the right thing, you can't. That's still the case in travel. Like, you don't know, well, if I ski at Blue Mountain with my family for 4 days versus hop on a plane to go to Whistler or Innsbruck, the carbon implications of that, of going to Innsbruck, are what my family would need for carbon for the entire year. Oh, well, that's not a trade-off I'm willing to do. I'll stay, or I'll go to Vermont or whatever the case. Like, I can still get that same experience at probably 10% the carbon. Okay, but we don't know that. Like, the travel industry doesn't provide that information. And so that's still a fundamental barrier to even those who want to do the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, if there was a cost associated with it, like if there was someone saying, here is your cost, if you want to go to Innsbruck, it's going to be X amount to offset your carbon, then everyone thinks twice about it. And I think that's also how you incentivize, is really cost related as well.
Yeah, like, I mean, a carbon tax is what economists would tell us, not just in tourism, but across the economy, is the simplest, cleanest thing. You pay for it every time you make that decision. It doesn't mean we don't bar you from buying that big, colossal, whatever, boat, land, whatever you want to do. But you'll pay for it all the way along, and we'll use those funds to try to create a low carbon economy, which is partly what was supposed to be the case. Whether that actually happens at our federal level, I don't know. But that's supposed to be where some of those climate dollars that are being collected go to.
I also worked on that file. I worked for the Ministry of the Environment in Ontario before starting as an academic, and I worked on that file. So yeah, that's maddening, because that was in the early 90s. Yes. So thank you so much, Dan. We're gonna wrap this up. I mean, I know I could talk to you forever on this, and hopefully we can meet someday soon and have some good conversations and figure some stuff out. Tommy, I will get to you about that train stuff and tell you the history about why we don't have train travel in Canada, because Tommy was asking about train travel. So thanks again, Dan. So as a part of our thank you, what we have been doing because of COVID is donating in your name to our Experiential Learning Fund. This last year, we went to the, talking about carbon intensive trips. We went up to the Arctic and went on, learned about Indigenous culture, but we have an experiential learning fund where our students actually, learn about tourism and social issues. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And everyone else, our next edition of Compass is on November 13th. At 12 p.m. and that's featuring Dr. Danielle Barb from Northumbria University from the UK, and she will be presenting on social media and tourism crisis communication. Dr. Barb is an alum of Ryerson and also the University of Florida, where she earned her master's and her PhD, and has contributed research to tourism crisis management. So join us for a presentation looking at hotels and destinations, social media responses to terrorism, natural disasters, and other crises. Also very, very pertinent during this time. So thank you all for attending. And I hope to see you all again for Danielle's presentation. And also we have a number of other Compass presentations. So please go on to HTMResearch. We have another University of Waterloo professor, Dr. Jeff Wall, coming up as well, December 3rd. So thanks again, Dan, and everyone for coming.
Great
nice
to
to
see
see you. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.